everybody. I'm George Stephanopoulos, and we're going to talk about what is prison for. We just heard Jeremy Travis talk about the goal of cutting prison populations in half and about the nuts and bolts of what that's going to take. In this panel, what we want to do is take a step back, a little more philosophical look at the idea of prison, the goal of putting people behind bars. And, it seems like a very simple notion. The idea of crime and punishment is sort of rooted in the idea of justice for so many people. But I think our panelists here have some layered and varied answers to that question based on the work they've done, the lives they've lived. And we're going to get right to it. And let me introduce our panelists right now. John Wetzel, Secretary of Corrections for Pennsylvania, formerly one of the youngest prison wardens in the nation's history. He's also gained a reputation as a reformer, oversees 26 prisons, 60 halfway houses, an annual budget of $2 billion. Next to him, the Honorable Eric Harmon, Superior Court Judge in Los Angeles, began his life campaigning against the death penalty in Texas. After that, 14 years as a district attorney in LA, a job that caused him to change his position on the death penalty. And as a judge, he's overseen hundreds of cases and handed down 25 life sentences, 3 death verdicts. Glenn Martin, far end, founder of Just Leadership USA. He and his organization advocate for policy changes to reduce incarceration. And before that, he actually was incarcerated for 6 years for armed robbery, spending 2 years at Rikers Island, another 4 in prison in upstate New York. And right to my left here, Jennifer Bishop Jenkins, a victims' rights advocate, founder of the National Organization for Victims of Juvenile Murderers. She campaigns against gun violence and serves on the U.S. Sentencing Commission's Victims Advisory Group. Judge Harmon, let me begin with you. You've had to send people to prison. You've sentenced a lot of people over the course of your career, sent them, and as a prosecutor as well. What is your simple answer to that question? When you send people to prison, what's the goal?
Well, when I sentence someone to prison, I look at 2 things. I look at the crime, and I look at the criminal. So I try to figure out who is the most violent among these criminals and the reasons for that violence, and then mete out a sentence accordingly. Oftentimes, when I see victims of crime speak in court on behalf of their loved ones, it's moving. I have a job to do also, which is to be objective. But I listen to the victims, and I listen to the damage that it's done to them so that I can fairly determine how long this person belongs in prison. Then I also look at the level and breadth of violence in their past. It's something it's staggering when I look at the violence against women, violence against children, sexual abuse, things of that nature. It's just pretty stomach-turning. So I look to see exactly who I'm dealing with, and then have we tried to administer the message to them before. If you keep doing this, you're going to go back to prison. If my hands are tied by a mandatory sentencing, which is very rare, by the way, then they go to prison out of the box for whatever enumerated crime they committed, typically something homicide-related or something that's sexually related.
It depends a little bit on the circumstances, but how much of what you do is simply to be a voice for the public and express the public's need for retribution, and some would even say vengeance?
Very little. I think of it more in terms of incapacitation. When do I need to get them out of the community? Because I keep in mind that when I was working on the streets of South LA, 99% of the people there are law-abiding who just want to go to work and church and school and raise their families. There's always 1 or 2 criminal street gangs, mostly, people who poison the water for the whole community. So I keep that in mind, and at a certain point, they got to go. They got to go through the metal doors.
And so it's about public safety.
Yes, that's pretty much what drives it, yeah.
And John, when you look at your mission as the warden of the prison, as the Secretary of Corrections, what is it you're trying to do?
We're trying to have people leave the back of our system, at least not worse, hopefully better than they came in, the front end of the system. One of the challenges is that we don't pick who comes. We're like Motel 6, we'll leave the light on for you. We take whoever comes up at our door. We do very well with higher risk offenders. They leave lower risk. Lower risk offenders leave higher risk. And that's just the reality of where we're at.
And what about this notion that so many prisons have just become sort of the college for becoming an even more sophisticated, even more violent criminal?
I think that's a fair argument. It's overly simplified, which is kind of the nature of corrections reform narrative often. But lower risk offenders who come into an intense environment that is a state prison often come out worse, often, especially younger, easily influenced without a strong male parental figure in their life. It's not a stretch to see them assume, or an older, more sophisticated inmate assume that father figure. And sometimes that's a good thing. We have a lot of men incarcerated who, at this point in their life, are good mentors and really try to guide folks. In some cases, that's not such a good thing. And that's the situation described. That's kind of how that happens.
Glenn, that did not happen to you. Why?
My experience in the criminal justice system, first of all, I always find these conversations interesting because whenever you have a conversation about the criminal justice system and you start with the most heinous crimes, it's difficult to have a rational conversation, and it doesn't match with who's ended up in our criminal justice system in the past 40 to 45 years. The truth is that we can do a better job of right-sizing our criminal justice system, but the one that we currently have is operating on full throttle with no one in the driver's seat, essentially. And what we've ended up with is what I experienced when I was in prison, which is that I left behind some of America's best and brightest. And so while some people may go to prison and learn how to be a better criminal, if you will, what I learned in prison was compassion and humanity from some of the people I served time with. Because the truth is, prison is not where we send bad people who do bad things. Prison is where we send good people who do bad things also. And so what I find is that if we are much more nuanced than we've been for the past 4 decades, we'll end up with folks like myself. I mean, I am no exception. People try to exceptionalize me, but the truth is that I was exposed to exceptional opportunities. And I think we do that for more people who find themselves with handcuffs on.
So how did you find yourself surrounded by people who could help you rather than hurt you?
I mean, I found that a correction counselor leaned over my shoulder one day and said, "Wow, your test scores look great. You should go to college." That could have happened to me 10 years earlier in the community. It didn't. It happened in the prison setting. And I was lucky enough to end up at one of the remaining college programs in prison in New York State. That was taken away by Congress in its infinite wisdom 20 years ago.
You've also, I guess, had to believe that getting that degree would make a difference, that in some way the system wasn't completely rigged against you.
Well, it was 2 things. One, again, it was the individual who took the time to invest in me and see something in me that I didn't see in myself. Secondly, the quality liberal arts college degree that I got helped me to rewrite the narrative that allowed me to commit crime in the first place. It essentially exposed me to an education that allowed me to realize I fit into society differently than how I thought I fit in when I grew up in a very poor community in Brooklyn, New York.
And Jennifer, you came to this from a tragedy.
Yes.
You've been advocating for victims' rights for some time now because of something that happened to your family. Why don't you tell us the story?
So some years ago, my sister, her husband, and their baby were murdered in suburban Chicago, and the killer was just shy of his adult age, so he was technically a juvenile, but was tried as an adult. He killed them for no reason other than the sheer thrill of it. He was your classic sociopath, psychopath. He picked them because their house was across the street from the police station, and he wanted to do it right under the police's nose and get away with it. My sister was a beautiful 25-year-old mother-to-be, and she and her husband were the dearest, most wonderful people, and they deserved to have their life, and it was taken from them. And by a man who is no doubt dangerous, tried to kill his parents before he killed my family members, was planning a mass murder after their murder. He was clearly a serial killer in the making.
And you think he should just be off the streets?
So I do think that prison has a purpose, and that is to incapacitate the dangerous, the truly dangerous. And I would completely concur with, I think, what is a consensus not only here today, but across the country, that prisons are overpopulated with not truly dangerous people. And that is definitely a problem we have to solve. But there are some dangerous people, and it is sad for us to recognize that there are dangerous people. But we have good science that helps us identify them now. We have risk assessment tools. We know how to find that 1% of all people who are psychopaths. And that's where we should be concentrating. The purpose of prisons is to incapacitate those people who are dangerous.
I want to follow up with John on this, but I wonder why, and I'm probably stepping into a bit of a thicket here. Why is everybody so reluctant to say that it's okay for there to be retribution and punishment?
I don't think that, I think that's a piece of the system. I think the issue becomes when we go too far to one extreme. And frankly, we can't afford retribution for everybody we're pissed off at. And that's frankly how we got where we're at. So retribution's great till we're broke.
So it's out of balance.
It's out of balance. And if the process of retribution leads to more crime at the back end, then what are we doing?
So what do you do with someone like the man who killed her sister? He's not going to be rehabilitated. Where does he go? What do you do?
He's in, I don't know what the
He's
sentence
serving
was
3
there.
life without parole sentences, and that's appropriate in his case.
And Tina wrote about visiting one of your prisons. It seems like even for those criminals, at what point do we say there has to be some sort of attempt at creating some kind of life, even if we want to exact the most severe punishment?
I think one of the things that's really interesting in this narrative is places like this, academic discussions. You know, it's really easy to be either or, but the reality is it's both and. And when you walk through and when you see the faces impacted, when you spend time with the family members of those who are killed, when you spend time with the children of incarcerated parents, these are all very difficult circumstances, and they're all very difficult decisions. But I think the question that we all have to ask ourselves as a society, as a country, is what are we trying to do? And when's enough enough? And I think that's where the conversation's coming. So when Tina walked through SCI Gradeford with us a couple weeks ago, we ran into an individual who was incarcerated for 46 years. He was incarcerated at a young age, Vietnam vet, suffering from PTSD at the time. And if you talk to that man today, the question is that the same man that committed the crime? And if the answer is no, then that's where the question comes in, when's enough enough? Now in Pennsylvania, life means life. That means that if we have 51,000 people incarcerated today, 5,100 of them will die in one of our prisons. And so the people like that really make the narrative not such an easy one. It may be an easy one here on this stage, but it's not an easy one when you're trying to balance, when you're trying to meter justice with mercy. And that's really, I think, the conflict that we all struggle with.
And it's in your hands. Every single day you have to be making these judgments about individuals before you, about the crimes they committed, about the possibility that this does not mark them forever. How do you do it?
Well, it's not an easy task. It goes back to one of the things that Glenn was saying about not letting violent crime drive the debate about prisons, not letting one end of the spectrum drive this whole discussion. You know, you can't talk about this topic without talking about race and inequality in America. You can't talk about this without talking about guns and domestic abuse that develops a sense of violence in children. You know, I can't tell you how many times I've heard a 911 call from, you know, a kid calling the police saying, come get mom's boyfriend off of mom. That's the culture that some of these kids would grow up in. So for me, it's not easy. I recognize all sides of it. It's better than being a DA and walking around with a hammer looking for nails. This is a chance to stand back and listen to everybody's story and make that individualized determination. It's not like the federal system where that's the small percentage of people incarcerated today are incarcerated in federal facilities. They're more like John's facilities, state-run. And those 14% of the people incarcerated in California are for drug-related offenses. Possession offenses, after Prop 47, it's almost done. You're not going to prison if you have heroin, cocaine, which might be the right answer. We can't let that, however, the war on drugs, so to speak, drive this whole discussion.
Let me add, well, first of all, I'm not used to a commissioner and a former prosecutor getting out ahead of me on productive talking points about this issue. But let me add some more nuance here, because when we have this adversarial system where we put people in one bucket or the other, right? Perpetrator or victim. And the truth is that people don't get on airplanes to go commit crimes. They commit crimes right there in their communities, in their building, in their homes, in their families, against themselves. And that means that communities that are disproportionately impacted by crime are similarly disproportionately impacted by victimization. And I think we need to do a better job of recognizing that, because in communities where the resources don't exist to respond to that sort of victimization, what we get is that it calcifies and people turn around and become the offender. I didn't learn how to pull out a gun on someone until someone pulled out a gun on me. And I think we have to have a criminal justice system that is much more nuanced in its approach to how people end up there. Because the drug offender today, I would argue, is the same guy who gets caught with a gun in his waist tomorrow, because it all goes with the lifestyle. Yet we put them on a totally different track as a result.
So what do you, I mean, I'm going to come to you in a second, but let's play it out here for a second. 18-year-old comes to you. Let's say it's a first offense, but he was part of a gang, and he was the guy that ended up holding the gun. Didn't shoot it, but he was holding it and maybe driving the car. It seems like he was, in some ways, a victim of the culture, yet he clearly did something wrong.
Yeah, I mean, you look for, I want to, when I'm sentencing somebody, look for the goodness in them too, you know. I want to see what Glenn was showing back then, and I look for it. Unfortunately, I don't want to say he's the exception, but I just don't see it that often. But somebody who's 18, who's young, whose brain is physiologically different than everybody else's, I tend to have more mercy on them absent some compelling, violent result. And it depends on what their support system is. Or have they been in the system before? Have we failed them by telling them, since they've been in YA, which is our youth authority, that you can do things without consequences? If we fail them in that sense, by the time they get to 18, there's no mystery about why he doesn't get that guns are bad. It's because we've been telling him that, you know, we're going to.
And in a case like
different.
that, how much flexibility? You said, I was surprised to hear you say you had a lot of flexibility. How much do you?
I have a ton. I have a ton, and that's what makes the speaker's point earlier about democracy. If you don't like the decision your judges are making, you can change who your judge is at the voting booth. I don't encourage it for those who are good, but my point is that you're not powerless there, and we need compassionate judges. It's hard to stay abreast of those issues, but my hands are tied only in a very limited way. If it's a sex crime against a kid, a murder, what I alluded to earlier. Other than that, I deny probation or send them to prison, and there are very few crimes that don't have the possibility of probation and getting an education and getting a job. You need a good advocate on their side, a public defender normally, somebody whose office is robustly funded so that they can present to me those compelling mitigation circumstances.
And Jennifer, you believe obviously the victims have to have a seat at that table.
Oh yeah, the
well.
victims have rights in the constitutions of 33 states and to participate. And this needs to be in the U.S. back in the U.S. Constitution. There's no question. But the point I wanted to make is I think all of this is absolutely correct. I'm not disagreeing with any of it. But we also have people like my sister's killer, who was from a wealthy home, had fantastic parents, went to a great school, had no trauma in his life, didn't have a violent history or background, lived in a $3 million house in Winnetka, Illinois, wealthy parents. He had every opportunity for a great life, but there was something really wrong with him. And we do have to do a better job, I think, of sorting out who those people are. And we know that there are people who are traumatized, and even victims. It's so true that people who are victimized when they're younger, the trauma in their brains, they actually can become victimizers. And it's really important that we use the prisons to treat trauma and to actually identify those who are trauma victims, because that does perpetuate the cycle. But we also need to recognize that there are some people who they grow up in horrific circumstances and never choose to commit crime. And there are some people who grow up in wonderful circumstances who do. And we have to find out what's going on there.
So I agree, and I applaud you for being so courageous to tell your story repeatedly. I think it's important that you do so. At the same time, here's my thought, that when I speak to victims, and I say to victims, what are they looking for from the criminal justice system, what they say more often than not is for the person to never do it again. And we have a criminal justice system that doesn't produce those outcomes. 2/3 of people who get out go back to prison within 3 years. And I can't think of any other industry that would operate with that failure rate and continue to operate.
Well, let's bring that back to John. I mean, your system is called the correction system in Pennsylvania. How do you shoot that idea through the entire system?
Yeah, and I think that certainly we're called the correction system, but you could make an honest argument that that's a misnomer at this point. And again, I don't think it's a simple answer. When you talk about how do we reel this in, where do we get to? The answer is simple to me. Insert science. Insert diagnostics at the front end. I mean, the similarities or the potential similarities between the corrections field and the medical field are so obvious to me. If you just look if I get knee surgery 30 years ago, I'd have a big scar up my knee. Now I'd have 3 holes, right? Same thing. They repaired the thing, but they do it now with less damage. And I think if we take that notion of how do we respond to crime in a manner that's less damage, it would look like less people coming through our front
So
door.
how would that work at the front end?
So you insert risk assessment early on in the system. And I always get a little nervous when I hear, we should be treating this or that in prison. We should, if that's the option. If we take the notion of saying, by the time someone comes to a state prison in Pennsylvania, they've been arrested 8 times, all right, 8 times. So you would say, that some would say, then they've earned their way to state prison. I would say, what the heck were we doing the previous 7 arrests? And what could we have inserted at that point at the first arrest before they escalate?
What does happen in the previous 7 arrests?
Cycle. And it could be, we're not identifying the root cause of the crime from the beginning. So if you think of, if I have a symptom, if I have a headache, and I go to the doctor and they give me Tylenol, or in our case, we'd probably do brain surgery and corrections. But if they give me Tylenol and never identify why I keep having headaches, I'm gonna have headaches forever. So if we don't identify the root cause at the beginning, it's just gonna continue itself. And we can do smokes and mirrors, we can do fancy things, and we can let more people at the back end. But if we don't fundamentally make the choice to insert science in our system, to use the tools that are available, to use academia, to use the body of research, to guide our systems. And the fact that we're up here advocating to use research to guide decisions tells us how screwed up we've put, our correction system has become. We wouldn't be having this discussion if we were all doctors, right? I mean, if you had a doctor who said, I'm just going to use common sense, you'd find a new damn doctor, and you should.
How does science influence your decisions, Judge?
Almost, unfortunately, not at all. I mean, I don't know a program that what do I tell somebody who's shot somebody in the face? What kind of program do they get? Do they go to corrections and unlearn that? They come to me with a set of problems that are perhaps uncurable, whether it be a lifetime of substance abuse, mental illness, and a culture of violence in a gang that I can't help them unlearn. And so sometimes I want to, but really, what do I tell them?
And
don't do it again? And
what was the turning point as a prosecutor where you said, death penalty does in some circumstances make sense?
that's a whole can of worms I'll probably get beat up on. But
that's what we're here for.
I just don't want to. When you sit with someone who's lost a loved one and you try to help them, and it's probably not that dissimilar to sitting across the table from somebody whose loved one is incarcerated, except one of them might be coming home, the other isn't. And it's so moving on a personal level that you just want to help them. And then you see what many of these perpetrators do when they get into the system, whether it be on prison guards, on nurses, on fellow inmates. I had a guy awaiting trial back in the old days for capital crime of raping and murdering, suffocating a 16-year-old girl. And while he was awaiting that, again, I don't want to get to the parade of horribles, but he raped his cellmate. What am I going to tell the guard in John's system when he gets stabbed? So that was something back then that drove me. Yeah. Now it's a much more sophisticated debate than just those ideas.
So with all due respect to the judge, this is how we got here.
Overruled.
Nice touch. That's nice touch.
Essentially, I think the media has played a role, right? If it bleeds, it leads. And the American public has seen the worst of the worst. What they see is the people who come back out, do it again. I worked at a reentry organization for 6.5 years where we saw 4,000 people per year, the majority of them trying to turn their lives around. I remember people who were working hard to get jobs, to get housing and so on, that would walk down the block into the train station, swipe their Metro card, drop it, and the police officer would grab them and lock them up. So you got to ask yourself, and these police officers knew we existed. They knew the organization was down the block. So why would you derail a person trying to turn their lives around?
So pick up on what John was saying then. If you go to the very front of the system, there was one thing you could do. If you could wave the magic wand today, what's supposed to happen that second arrest that is not happening now?
So I think that we have to, again, shrink the size of the system so we can pay more attention to a person when they come in with that first arrest. I didn't do 6 years on my first arrest, right? I went in and out of the system with a bunch of petty crimes where no one paid attention. And it wasn't until I kept going back to the street, figuring no one cared, that I ended up graduating to more and more serious things. So I think, again, if we go from 2.3 million to a system that looks more like where we were in 1980, 500,000, then hopefully the existing resources in the system would capture young folks when they come in, and there's actually a better opportunity to help them turn their lives around.
Go ahead.
But we have to do more even before the first arrest. The major difference between our country and other countries in the world is easy access to illegal guns.
And racism.
And that's a huge problem. And racism. Yeah, racism. Although racism exists in other countries, but it is a huge problem that we arm what would be otherwise petty violence. But we also should be doing these risk assessments in schools. My sister's murderer was a high school student, and I had people tell me afterwards, oh, well, I knew he was going to do that. Well, then why didn't you say something? Why wasn't the threats that he made, why weren't they taken seriously? Why wasn't he identified as the psychopath that he was and then treated prior to that? Right now we have a major structural problem. We aren't allowed to really treat and interdict with psychopaths until they do something. And we need to do better in the prevention end.
John, what about alternative models like drug courts, addiction programs? What's the role?
Again, I think if you just take this notion of have the response to crime equal to the crime itself and get to the root cause, all that stuff comes in play. But I'll tell you, we're doing a disservice if we're talking about corrections reform and we ignore the notion of community reform. Listen, it's not corrections that's locking people up. Let's talk realities, and let's look at how someone ends up incarcerated. And let's look at our poorest and most disadvantaged communities, and let's look at the education system in those communities countrywide. And then, you hear things like, if a young black man drops out of school, 7 out of 10 times he's going to be locked up. Well, let's keep him in school, right? So let's focus this narrative not just on the really tight parameters of corrections and what happens in the vault, well, that's important, and what happens when they get involved with law enforcement. The discussion around school discipline and looking at the disproportionate Council of State Governments did the consensus report on school discipline, and you see the same disproportionate sanctions, and then that correlates to people who are thrown out of school, and then that correlates to people who are locked up. So let's look broadly at this, and let's get to that root cause. If you call a cop to a school, he's going to arrest someone. That's what cops do. So don't get mad at the cop for arresting somebody. If you call him, call caseworker.
Glenn, you were raising your hand.
I was going to say, especially in this forum, we should be reminded that language is extremely important. Not just the language we use to refer to people who are in our criminal justice system, because that language itself is pretty loaded. But even alternatives to incarceration, the assumption there is that incarceration is the answer, and perhaps we can find some sort of alternative. And if we're really looking at paradigm shift, I think prison just needs to be the last option when we're not finding anything else. That's where we should start. And the United States has had the longest running, most successful diversion program of anywhere in the world. It's called White Skin. We've been doing it for a really long time. And so the truth is there are many people who end up in the criminal justice system with crimes, similarly situated, different color skin, different class, that end up with totally different outcomes.
There does seem to be a lot of ferment in our political system right now, and we only have a couple minutes left, so I just want to go down the row and assume you're sitting in front of the President, the new leader of the Senate, and the Speaker of the House. What's the one thing you would want them to know and you'd want them to do?
Well, it's not just one thing, but they do need to support victims of violence and make sure that they are protected, because that does contribute to the cycle of violence. And we spend so much time and resources helping those that are troubled. We need to help those who've been hurt as well. And we need to prevent the flow of illegal guns into our communities. And we need to address the mental health. We need to identify those problems early and solve them.
It's simple. First of all, leave your R or your D or your I at the door. Focus on the outcomes that the citizens need. And understand that in this moment in time, we have a brief opportunity to really fundamentally change how we deliver criminal justice policy in America, and parlay off this moment in time and go big or go home.
It's money. We need more money for courts. We need to have a public defender system, court-appointed system where we have the best. We have great ones now. We need more of them. We have great DAs now, we just need more of them, ethical and hardworking. And then a forum so that I don't have 50 cases on my calendar every day and I got to make decisions like that. Recruiting judges from different communities so that the community has faith in the system because the bench reflects where they came from. But sadly, I think it comes down to more judges that can give more thought to these issues.
I'd say values, that the criminal justice system that we've ended up with doesn't match the values that we have as Americans, and we can do a whole lot better as a country.
That was a really stimulating discussion. Thank you all very much. Thank you.